In 1913, a man walked into the United States Senate chamber and did something no banker had ever dared to do before. He told them the truth, not the polite version, not the sanitized version for public consumption. The actual truth about who controlled American money, who decided which businesses lived or died, and why the entire financial system was designed to keep ordinary people perpetually in debt. His name was J.P. Morgan. And for 3 days he sat in that chair and explained exactly how he'd built an empire so large that entire industries existed only because he allowed them to. He was 76 years old, his health was failing, he had nothing left to prove and everything to lose. But he spoke anyway. What he said in that courtroom changed American finance forever, not because Congress acted on his testimony, they didn't, but because for the first time in history, the architect of modern capitalism explained the system out loud, in public, under oath. And what he revealed was so disturbing that within months the government would create an entirely new institution, designed specifically to prevent anyone from ever holding that much power again. This is the story of the Pujo hearings, the last time a financial titan stood trial before the American people. The moment when the invisible hand of the market showed its face, and the speech that exposed the greatest economic illusion ever sold to the public, that the men who controlled the money were simply better at business than everyone else. If you want to understand why your dollar buys less every year, why housing costs what it does, why entire industries collapse while banks get bailouts, you need to understand what happened in that Senate chamber in 1913, because the system Morgan described that day is still running. It just learned to hide better. Subscribe now, because next week I'm breaking down the exact mechanisms Morgan used to control 6 major industries simultaneously, and how those same structures operate today under different names. You'll recognize every single one. The year was 1912, and America was having an identity crisis. The country had spent the previous 3 decades transforming from an agricultural economy into an industrial superpower. Railroads connected the coasts. Steel mills ran 24 hours a day. Oil wells pumped black gold that would fuel the next century. And every single one of those industries, every factory, every mine, every railroad line, required one thing above all else: capital. Money to build, money to expand, money to survive the inevitable crashes that came every 10 to 15 years like clockwork. And there was exactly one place in America where that kind of money could be found. Not a place, actually. A person. J.P. Morgan controlled more liquid capital than the United States Treasury. When the federal government needed emergency funding during the Panic of 1907, they didn't go to Congress. They went to Morgan's library on Madison Avenue and waited while he decided whether the nation was worth saving. He decided yes, but only after extracting concessions that would make him even richer. October 1907. The Knickerbocker Trust Company collapsed, triggering bank runs across New York. Treasury Secretary George Courtelieu took a train from Washington straight to Morgan's office at 23 Wall Street. Not to the president, not to Congress, to a private banker. Courtelieu deposited $25 million of government money into Morgan's banks, essentially giving Morgan control over federal funds. Morgan set up a command center in his library and locked the doors. He told the assembled bankers they weren't leaving until they'd pulled $23 million to save the weakest trust companies. When some hesitated, Morgan stared them down. They agreed. But Morgan didn't save everyone. The Knickerbocker Trust, he let it die. Moore and Schley Brokerage, he saved them, but only because they held Tennessee coal and iron stock as collateral. Morgan wanted that stock for U.S. Steel, so he arranged for U.S. Steel to buy Tennessee coal and iron at bargain prices, which would stabilize the collateral and prevent another crash. One problem: U.S. Steel already controlled 60% of American steel production. Buying their largest competitor would create a near-total monopoly. Morgan sent 2 partners on an emergency train to meet President Theodore Roosevelt at 6 a.m. They explained that without this acquisition, the financial system would collapse by day's end. Roosevelt agreed not to prosecute U.S. Steel for antitrust violations. The deal went through. U.S. Steel got a billion-dollar company for $45 million. Morgan saved the economy and massively enriched his own company in the same transaction. That's who walked into the Senate chamber in 1912. That's the world the Pujo Committee walked into when they began their investigation in 1912. Named after Louisiana Representative Arsen Pujo, the committee had one job: determine whether a small group of bankers had formed a money trust that violated antitrust laws. It wasn't a question anyone really needed to investigate. Everyone already knew the answer, but knowing and proving are different things, and proving requires testimony. The committee had already spent months interviewing smaller financiers, tracking the web of interlocking directorates that connected every major bank in New York to every major corporation in America. They documented how a handful of men sat on dozens of boards simultaneously, how Morgan Partners held director positions at US Steel, General Electric, AT&T, and the railroads that transported goods for all of them. They'd shown how competition was an illusion when the same men controlled the competitors. But they needed the architect himself. They needed Morgan. Getting him into that chamber took months of legal maneuvering. Morgan was not a man who answered summons. He was not a man who explained himself to government officials he considered his intellectual inferiors. He'd built his empire on secrecy, on private agreements made in closed rooms where handshakes were worth more than contracts. The idea of testifying in public under oath with stenographers recording every word was anathema to everything his world represented. But the committee had leverage. The country was angry about the panic of 1907 that had wiped out savings accounts while Morgan got richer, angry about monopolies that fixed prices and crushed competition, angry about a system where opportunity seemed reserved for those who already had everything. If Morgan refused to testify, he'd confirm every accusation against him. If he testified and lied, he'd commit perjury. If he testified and told the truth, he'd expose the machinery that kept him in power. He chose truth, not out of nobility, out of arrogance. Morgan genuinely believed that what he'd built was not just legal, but necessary. That without men like him making the hard decisions, capitalism would collapse into chaos. That the concentration of power in a few capable hands was not a bug in the system, but its most essential feature. He thought if he just explained it clearly enough, people would understand. He was wrong. The questioning began on December 18th, 1912. Morgan entered the Senate caucus room wearing a dark suit that had been tailored in London, carrying a cigar he wasn't allowed to smoke indoors, moving with the slow deliberation of a man whose body was failing, but whose mind remained sharp. He sat in the witness chair, placed his hands on the armrests like a king assuming a throne, and waited. Samuel Untermeyer, the committee's chief counsel, didn't waste time on pleasantries. He opened with the simplest question possible, the one Morgan had spent his entire career avoiding. Mr. Morgan, is it not a fact that you have controlling influence over a great number of important financial institutions? Morgan's answer was immediate. No, sir, I do not. The room went silent. Every person in that chamber knew it was a lie. Not a legal lie, not a semantic dodge, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what control meant. Untermeyer pressed. You do not consider that you have any control over these institutions? No, Morgan said again. I do not. Not even a moral control. And this is where it got interesting, because Morgan paused. He looked at Untermeyer like a teacher disappointed in a particularly slow student. Then he said something that would be quoted in economics textbooks for the next century. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. There it was, the entire system distilled into one sentence. Morgan didn't control companies through majority ownership. He controlled them through access to credit. If you wanted to build a railroad, you needed Morgan's approval. If you wanted to expand your factory, you needed Morgan's capital. If you wanted to survive a financial panic, you needed Morgan to decide you were worth saving. And whether you received any of that depended not on your business plan, not on your collateral, not on objective financial metrics, but on whether J.P. Morgan personally trusted you. Character, he called it. Credit is based on character. It sounded almost noble when he said it, like he was defending virtue against crass materialism. But Untermeyer understood what it actually meant. It meant Morgan had appointed himself the sole judge of who deserved success in America. It meant the entire economy ran on his personal whims. Untermeyer asked the obvious follow-up. Is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property? No, sir, Morgan replied. The first thing is character. Before money or property. Before money or anything else. Money cannot buy it. It was masterful rhetoric, and it was complete fiction. The committee had already documented exactly how his empire actually worked. They'd traced the money, they'd mapped the connections, They knew that Morgan's version of character had a very specific definition, being willing to let Morgan and his partners take a cut of every transaction, accept Morgan's chosen board members, follow Morgan's strategic direction, and never compete with Morgan's other holdings. The questioning continued for hours. Untermeyer made Morgan acknowledge that he held directorships at 21 corporations, that his partners held dozens more, that together the House of Morgan controlled banks holding $2.5 billion in deposits at a time when the entire federal budget was $700 million. That Morgan had engineered the formation of U.S. Steel specifically to eliminate competition. That he'd organized railroad mergers to reduce competition in transportation. That he'd created interlocking directorates precisely because they allowed coordination without the messiness of formal monopolies. Morgan admitted all of it. He saw no reason to hide. In his worldview, concentration of power was good. It prevented destructive competition. It allowed for long-term planning. It created stability. Untermeyer asked about the Northern Pacific corner of 1901, when Morgan and E. H. Harriman had tried to buy the same railroad simultaneously, driving the stock price so high that it bankrupted dozens of smaller investors. Morgan's response was cold. I was buying the stock for investment. As if that explained why retail investors had lost everything when two titans decided to fight over the same company. The committee had discovered that Morgan partnerships held director positions at 112 corporations with aggregate resources of $22.2 billion. That was more than the total assessed value of all property in the 22 states west of the Mississippi River. Do you not think that is a dangerous concentration of financial power? Untermeyer asked. Morgan looked genuinely confused by the question. I do not. I think it is a good thing. You think concentration of financial power is a good thing? If it is in the right hands, yes. And you consider your hands to be the right hands? Morgan didn't hesitate. Yes. The arrogance was breathtaking, but it was also honest. Morgan truly believed that he and his partners were uniquely qualified to control American capital, that their judgment was superior, that the economy functioned better when they made the decisions. The most revealing exchange came on the second day, when Untermeyer asked about competition. You are opposed to competition, are you not? Morgan didn't hesitate. No, sir, I do not mind competition. You would rather have combination, would you not? Yes? You would rather have combination than competition. I would rather have combination. There it was again. The truth stated plainly. Morgan preferred combination over competition. He preferred coordination over markets. He preferred a world where a small group of men sat in rooms and decided how industries would operate over the chaos of actual capitalism. He genuinely believed this was better for everyone, more efficient, more rational, more stable. And he was right about the stability part. Morgan's system did prevent certain types of chaos. It did allow for longer-term planning. It did eliminate wasteful competition. But it also eliminated something else, opportunity. In Morgan's world, you succeeded because Morgan allowed it. You failed because Morgan willed it. The game was rigged before you walked in the room, and the referee was taking a cut from the house. The questioning turned to the money trust's political power. Untermeyer presented evidence that Morgan and his associates had financed the campaigns of dozens of congressmen and senators, that they'd placed their men in key positions at the Treasury Department, that they'd influenced the appointment of judges who would rule on antitrust cases. Morgan acknowledged the connections but denied any impropriety. He'd supported politicians who understood business, he said, men who recognized that what was good for Morgan was good for America. The committee pressed him on his relationship with the Rothschilds in Europe, on how he coordinated with London bankers to control international gold flows, on how he'd used his position as America's unofficial central banker to manipulate currency markets. Morgan grew irritated. These were technical matters, he insisted. Complex financial instruments that laymen couldn't possibly understand. The economy required expert management, and he was the expert. But the longer he talked, the clearer the picture became. Morgan had built a system where money flowed through a single choke point. Companies that needed capital came to Morgan. Investors who wanted returns came to Morgan. Governments that needed loans came to Morgan. He sat at the center of the web, taking a percentage of every transaction, placing his men on every board, ensuring that nothing happened in American finance without his knowledge and approval. It wasn't illegal. That was the genius of it. Morgan hadn't violated any specific statute. He'd simply recognized that in a capitalist economy, whoever controls access to capital controls everything else. He'd consolidated that control through careful relationship building, strategic marriages between companies, and the ruthless elimination of anyone who tried to compete on his terms. He'd turned trust into a tradable commodity, and he held a monopoly on it. On the third day, Untermeyer asked the question that would define Morgan's legacy. Under your definition of credit, when you say a man is entitled to credit, you mean he is entitled to money? Morgan nodded. Money or goods. And when you say he is not entitled to credit, you mean he is not entitled to either money or goods? That is the same thing. So that when you refuse a man credit, you refuse him money or goods? Yes. And in the United States, that means his business may fail. Morgan paused, then quietly. Yes. There it was. The admission that destroyed his entire defense. Morgan had spent 3 days arguing that he didn't control these companies, that his power was based on trust and character rather than coercion. But Untermeyer had gotten him to admit the underlying truth. If Morgan refused to extend credit, businesses failed. If businesses failed, workers lost jobs. If workers lost jobs, families went hungry. The entire economy depended on Morgan's goodwill. That wasn't trust, that was power. Absolute, unaccountable power concentrated in the hands of one man who answered to no one. The questioning ended on December 20th. Morgan left the Senate chamber knowing his world had changed. The testimony would be published. Newspapers would dissect every word. The public would read about the money trust in detail for the first time, and they would be horrified. Morgan died 3 months later in Rome. He travelled to Europe for his health, but the real cause of death was simpler. The hearings had broken something in him. For his entire life, he'd believed he was a hero, the man who saved capitalism from itself, the adult in the room making hard decisions while lesser men complained. The Pujo testimony had shown him how the rest of the country saw him, as a robber baron who'd rigged the game. His estate was worth $80 million, a staggering sum for the time. But when financial analysts examined his actual holdings, they realized something shocking. Most of the companies Morgan supposedly controlled weren't majority owned by him. He'd operated primarily with other people's money, taking fees and percentages, while the actual ownership was distributed among thousands of smaller investors. He'd built the greatest financial empire in American history on leverage, trust, and the perception of power. The perception had been enough. Within months of Morgan's death, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, creating a central banking system specifically designed to prevent any individual from ever holding Morgan's level of power again. The irony, of course, is that the Federal Reserve essentially institutionalized what Morgan had done informally. It centralized control over credit and currency, but placed that control in a government institution rather than private hands. Same choke point, different owner. The Clayton Antitrust Act followed in 1914, outlawing interlocking directorates and other tactics Morgan had pioneered. Companies could no longer share board members with their competitors. Banks could no longer sit on the boards of the companies they financed. The web Morgan had spent decades building was forcibly untangled. But here's what they couldn't legislate away. The fundamental insight Morgan had discovered. In a debt-based economy, whoever controls access to credit controls everything. The Federal Reserve replaced Morgan, but the mechanism remained the same. Instead of one man deciding who deserved loans, a committee of central bankers made that decision. Instead of Morgan's library, it happened in marble buildings in Washington, but the power dynamic was identical. And that brings us to today. The names have changed, the institutions are different, but the structure Morgan described in 1913 is still running. 6 banks control more than half of America's banking assets. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street collectively own major stakes in almost every large corporation in America. The same board members rotate through multiple companies in the same industries. Private equity firms buy up entire sectors and coordinate pricing across supposedly competing businesses. It's legal now, they've made it legal, but it's the same system. But Take the airline industry. There are 4 major carriers: American, Delta, United, and Southwest. They're supposedly competitors, but BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are top shareholders in all 4. The same 3 firms that own chunks of American also own chunks of Delta, United, and Southwest. When American Airlines announced it would charge for checked bags in 2008, the other 3 followed within weeks. When United reduced legroom, the others matched. This isn't competition. This is Morgan's system with better camouflage. The same pattern appears in pharmaceuticals. The 3 largest insulin manufacturers control 90% of the insulin market. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street own large stakes in all 3. Between 2002 and 2013, insulin prices tripled. All 3 manufacturers raised prices in near-perfect synchronization. That's not market forces. That's coordination. But these firms don't directly control corporate decisions, right? They just own shares on behalf of their clients. True. But they vote those shares. And BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street cast votes representing trillions of dollars in assets. CEOs know that if they want to do a big merger or change strategy, they need buy-in from the big 3. It's Morgan's character-based credit system translated into the modern era. The private equity industry has taken this even further. Firms like Blackstone, KKR, and Apollo buy up entire sectors using borrowed money, load companies with debt, extract fees, and leave. Look at Toys R Us. In 2005, KKR and Bain bought the company for $6.6 billion using mostly borrowed money. They saddled Toys R Us with $5 billion in debt. The company had been profitable. After the buyout, it spent $400 million a year on debt service. Money that could have gone to competing with Amazon instead went to interest payments. Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy in 2017. 33,000 workers lost their jobs. The private equity firms walked away with $470 million in fees. Morgan would have loved this. It's his system perfected. The Federal Reserve, created specifically to prevent another Morgan, has become the ultimate guarantor of this system. When the 2008 crisis hit, the Fed created $4.5 trillion and used it to buy toxic assets from banks that had made catastrophically bad bets. The people running the Fed were the same people who'd run those banks or would run them in the future. Ben Bernanke left the Fed and became a consultant for Citadel. Timothy Geithner left Treasury and became president of a private equity firm. This is the revolving door Morgan pioneered. And just like Morgan's testimony in 1913, everyone involved will tell you this is necessary, that financial markets require expert management, that ordinary people don't understand the complexity, that concentration of power creates stability. They'll use different words, talk about systemic risk and macroprudential regulation. But the message is the same. Trust us to make the important decisions. The difference between Morgan's era and ours is that Morgan's system eventually became visible enough that Congress investigated it. Our system has learned to hide better. The web of ownership is so complex it takes teams of researchers months to map. The connections between Wall Street and Washington are so normalized nobody sees them as corruption anymore. But the mechanism is unchanged. Credit still flows through choke points controlled by a small number of institutions. They still decide which companies get capital. They still coordinate pricing across supposedly competitive industries. They still operate under the assumption that what's good for them is good for the economy. Because here's what Morgan got wrong, and what his modern successors get wrong. Concentration of power doesn't create stability. It creates fragility. When one institution or a small group controls everything, a single bad decision can bring down the entire system. That's what happened in 1907. That's what happened in 2008. It will happen again. True stability comes from diversity, from many institutions making independent decisions based on different information, from real competition that punishes bad decisions and rewards good ones, from distributing power widely enough that no single failure cascades through everything. But that's not the system we have. We have Morgan's system with better technology and more sophisticated marketing. We have a financial oligarchy that insists it's a meritocracy. We have concentration of power that calls itself efficiency. When Morgan said credit is based on character, what he meant was credit is based on relationships, on access, on being part of the club. And if you're not in the club, if you don't have the right connections, if you can't pick up the phone and get Morgan or his modern equivalent on the line, then all the bonds in Christendom won't save you when the next crisis hits. The Pujo hearings were supposed to be a turning point, the moment when America rejected concentrated financial power and returned to competitive markets. Instead, they were a tutorial. Morgan showed them exactly how he'd done it, and the next generation of financiers took notes. They learned to hide better, to use shell companies and complex derivatives instead of simple directorships, to operate through institutions rather than personalities, to make the web so complicated that no congressional committee could map it in 3 days of testimony. But the web is still there. You can see it if you know where to look. When competing airlines all raise baggage fees on the same day. When pharmaceutical companies all price the same drug within pennies of each other. When banks all adopt the same fee structures simultaneously. That's not market competition. That's coordination. It's Morgan's system with better PR. The lesson Morgan tried to teach in 1913 was that concentrated power is necessary for stability. That experts should make decisions about credit and capital because ordinary people don't understand the complexity. That character matters more than rules. Every single one of those arguments is still being made today by the people who run the Federal Reserve, by the executives at BlackRock and JP Morgan Chase, by the economists who insist that financial regulation kills innovation. But the lesson the public learned was different. They learned that when power concentrates, it serves itself. That stability for the powerful often means precarity for everyone else. That character-based credit is just another way of saying only people we approve of get access to resources. That the invisible hand of the market is often just a very visible hand belonging to someone who doesn't want you to notice them pulling the strings. Morgan stood trial in 1913, but the system he built was acquitted. It's still running, it still decides who gets capital and who doesn't, and it still rewards coordination over competition. It still concentrates power in fewer and fewer hands while telling everyone else that this is just how markets work. The difference is we're not supposed to notice anymore. Morgan's mistake wasn't building the empire, it was admitting it existed. Next week I'm breaking down the exact corporate structures that replaced Morgan's interlocking directorates and why they're actually more powerful than what he built. The algorithm thinks you'll find that one particularly disturbing. Click it when it appears. And if you made it this far, if you actually want to understand how money works instead of just accepting the version they teach in economics classes, subscribe now. Most people won't. They'll watch this video, feel briefly outraged, and then go back to assuming the system is basically fair. You're not most people. Subscribe, and I'll see you next week.